On November 14, 1951, deputies in McDowell County, West Virginia, pried open the rusted filing cabinets of the long-abandoned Ashcroft State Asylum. The building had been shuttered for almost a decade, but court orders demanded its records be turned over to Charleston for proper state archiving. The deputies expected medical files, admission logs, perhaps the usual patient treatment charts. What they found instead was worse than nothing. The cabinets contained no patient records. Not one intake form, no names, no dates of admission, no medication logs. The folders inside bore only the names of staff members, orderlies, nurses, a handful of doctors. And yet, in the same courthouse basement where these cabinets were delivered, burial permits recorded over 50 deaths at Ashcroft in 1951 alone. Bodies had been lowered into county ground with paperwork stamped and sealed, but without a single trace of who those people were supposed to be. According to county records, the staff roster in that year included just 22 employees, meaning there were more bodies buried than names recorded on file. In a 1973 Field Journal, Dr. Marlene Price, an anthropologist with the University of Kentucky, wrote, "The names are gone, but the graves are real. Who, or what, was treated here?" The Ashcroft Asylum had always been a quiet stain on McDowell County's history. Its foundation stone was laid in 1901, on the ridge above Elkhorn Creek, funded not by the state but through a shadowed line item in the accounts of the McDowell Coal Company. The logic then was simple. Miners went mad in the shafts and the county needed a place to put them. But if that were true, where were the medical files? Why was there no admission ledger, no evidence of treatment, no correspondence with Charleston's Department of Health? Instead, what exists in fragmented detail are documents that feel like whispers. A single page in a 1937 county ledger, listing Ashcroft, 14 inmates transferred, 14 inmates received. No names. Just numbers. A property deed from 1927 that marks the asylum grounds not as hospital land, but as unincorporated labor housing. And a curious entry in the McDowell Gazette, July 12, 1942. Chapel bells heard from Ashcroft at midnight, though no service was scheduled. When the deputies opened the building, they described a smell not of rot, but of something damp, woolen, and strangely sour, like milk turned bad in the heat. Inside, the beds were made. The trays in the cafeteria still stacked. But the rooms showed no sign of occupancy. In some places, dust lay inches deep. In others, it looked freshly disturbed. One deputy later told his son in an interview recorded in 1986, "It was like they were keeping house for people who weren't there. We searched 100 rooms. I never found a single toothbrush." The graves, however, remained. A small cemetery plot at the base of the hill holds unmarked stones, their inscriptions eaten by weather. County permits record 52 burials in 1951, 48 in 1950, and irregular numbers stretching back decades. But the dead were never named. The permits say only, "Body received, Ashcroft State." And yet, no corresponding death certificates exist in the state registry. It is as if the county buried bodies the state refuses to admit ever lived. The shadows of Ashcroft stretch into oral histories, carried through whispers in the Hollows families whose kin disappeared not into the ground, but into the asylum's walls. A grandmother in Elkhorn swore her brother was sent there in 1929, only for his name to vanish from all records by 1930. A 1961 interview with Lena Hartsfield, aged 83, recorded in the Gazette, carries her warning, "They weren't healing sick men. They were feeding shadows. That's why no one came out." The Hartsfield family left McDowell in 1963. Their house was stripped and burned. Not one relative ever returned. The more one looks at Ashcroft, the more its records collapse into contradiction. Tax ledgers from 1934 list the asylum as vacant. Yet a county budget report from that same year assigns funds for food deliveries to Ashcroft. Payroll sheets exist for staff, yet many of those same employees appear on census rolls listed as deceased before they supposedly worked there. And then there are the journals. Small fragments scattered. A nurse's diary found in a trunk auctioned in Bluefield, 1979, with an entry dated March 2, 1948. "We prepared them again. Beds without weight, meals without mouths." Dr. Ashcroft says it matters that the motions are kept. If the asylum had simply been cruel, its horror would be plain. If it had been an experiment, the missing files might suggest cover-up. But the strange consistency of absence suggests something deeper, as though the institution was never built for people at all. Dr. Price, in her Field Journal, proposed a thought that unsettles researchers even now. What if the function of Ashcroft was not to treat the ill, but to provide ritual for the unseen? To walk through the remains today is to step into a kind of hollow echo. Locals say birds refuse to land on its chimney. Hunters swear their dogs circle wide around the property, whining, refusing to cross its overgrown gates. Even in winter, the frost does not cling to its walls, as if the building exhales. The shadows inside remain heavy. And for those who've broken in, the trespassers, the amateur ghost hunters, the folklore students, their testimonies circle the same detail. The silence there is not empty. It is thick. It bends. It waits. The file that should have never been found, the one that listed staff instead of patients, remains in Charleston's archive, stamped and sealed but never digitized. Access requires special permission. And every researcher who's studied it leaves with more questions than answers. Because when you run the names of the staff through genealogy records, many of them appear again and again. A nurse named Lillian Ashcroft signs payroll slips in 1903, 1927, and 1951. A doctor named Silas Ashcroft appears on staff rosters for nearly half a century. Handwriting analysis suggests the signatures are identical. So either the staff lived impossibly long lives, or the asylum's ledger was written by something or someone that never changed. And to this day, no birds land near the chimney. No matter the season. No matter the wind. McDowell County was never meant to hold a secret as large as Ashcroft, yet its geography made silence possible. The county folds in on itself like a fist, ridges pressed tight, valleys narrow, creeks running black with coal dust. The mines carved not just the land but the people, and when the veins of coal gave out, what remained was a skeleton of industry surrounded by towns too far off the highway to matter. McDowell was a place the state forgot to finish, the kind of place where a town's name could vanish off the map without anyone outside noticing. The rails once pulled endless coal trains through Welch, War, and Kimball, but when the seams thinned after the Depression, companies closed their shafts, pulled their payrolls, and left entire hollows abandoned. Families who had worked for generations found their doors boarded by the very companies they served, and with no farmland left and no industry promised, most drifted north to Huntington, Columbus, or Pittsburgh. What lingered behind was silence and a few stubborn families who believed leaving would kill them faster than staying. The census tells its own kind of ghost story. In 1920, McDowell County's population neared 100,000. By 1950, it had fallen below 60,000. By the late 1960s, the valley towns of Algoma and Vivian were described in state reports as diminished to non-viable. What official records call non-viable, oral histories call cursed. Locals whispered that these towns were not abandoned, but absorbed, their homes pulled into something deeper than the ground. In archives of the McDowell Gazette from the 1930s, small notes appear in the margins of ordinary life. A school board resignation, a missing preacher, a woman wandering in from the ridges without shoes or memory. Each line seems isolated, but when placed together, they sketch the outline of a county unraveling in ways that numbers alone cannot show. Property tax ledgers from 1927 still listed the Holloway family as active, despite no burial records or census data after 1925. Their house, perched above Wilco, was photographed in 1938 by a Works Progress Administration survey team. The photo shows windows covered in heavy boards, a chimney half collapsed, yet county tax rolls claimed it remained occupied. Neighbors swore the house smoked at night, though no one lived inside. Economic collapse is rarely just financial. It seeps into the rituals of a town, reshaping memory. In Welch, a once busy courthouse saw trials dwindle until entire weeks passed with no proceedings. Churches, once filled with minors, dwindled to congregations of 5 or 6. And when a place grows this quiet, the line between folklore and fact blurs. Oral traditions were no longer told as bedtime warnings but as explanations, as desperate anchors to a reality that no longer held. Some families insisted the towns didn't vanish from lack of work. They were bled away by Ashcroft. Coal camp churches recorded strange additions in their hand-copied ledgers. Baptism lists from the early 1940s include not just children but adults described as reclaimed. The notes beside their names read, "Brought back from the hollow, not speaking, cleansed through water." No one outside these churches knows what hollow they meant, but the entries stop abruptly after 1949, the same year the county recorded a spike in unexplained institutional transfers. The landscape itself reinforces secrecy. McDowell's hollows are shaped like funnels, pulling sound inward. A cry at the ridge might never reach the town below. Roads were never fully paved, bridges often rotted through, and a single flood could strand entire communities. When Route 52 construction was rerouted in 1935, Whole towns were cut off from easy access, and those cut-off places became ideal shadows for institutions like Ashcroft. The further one drove into the ridges, the less likely any map could be trusted. By the early 1950s, when deputies broke open Ashcroft's filing cabinets, McDowell had already been whittled into something brittle and forgettable. Outsiders described the county as a place where even silence felt heavy. Journalists from Charleston or Huntington rarely traveled there, and when they did, they wrote of it as though stepping into a different century. The absence of external witnesses meant rumors became permanent record. Some said entire schools shut down not from lack of children but because every child spoke in the same slow cadence, repeating the same hymns they were never taught in class. Others swore the mines closed not from depletion but because workers carried songs into the shafts that made the walls tremble. This vanishing wasn't sudden but gradual. Year by year, the lights went out, the newspapers thinned, and the archives filled with contradictions. By 1956, the county clerk's own office contained dozens of redacted pages marked only with the phrase "file withheld." Some were property records, some were school logs, others were transfers of guardianship for children whose parents supposedly left for Ohio, though no forwarding addresses were ever found. The people who stayed behind rarely gave interviews, but when they did, they spoke with the quiet certainty of those who believed their truth would not survive paper. In 1962, folklorist Helen Bailey recorded a testimony from George McGraw of North Fork, then aged 74. He said, "It weren't the coal that broke the town. It weren't the money neither. It was the house up there. It breathed us out. Every time someone left, that place drew tighter. And the ones that stayed? They weren't themselves after." Bailey's notes were never formally published, but they circulate among graduate researchers who study Appalachian oral traditions. Every collapsing economy leaves scars, empty storefronts, hollow schools, fading towns, but McDowell's scars seemed curated, as though each absence was maintained. Houses sat abandoned without being claimed by vines. Rail lines rusted yet never fully disappeared beneath weeds. Bridges stood half-broken but never washed away. The towns were left not to vanish but to wait. By the time state inspectors attempted to reclassify Ashcroft's property in 1960, McDowell's population had declined so steeply that few resisted. The inspectors noted only that the land remained in possession of the Ashcroft Trust, though no trust records existed in Charleston or Washington. The town of Elkhorn petitioned to remove the asylum from its official map boundary, and the state agreed. From then on, Ashcroft was not simply abandoned, it was erased, left in the folds of a county already dissolving into silence. And in the absence of industry, of churches, of schools, the hollows filled with their own kind of sound. Locals described nights where the bells of Ashcroft rang though no one stood in its tower. Others claimed to hear hymns traveling down the valley, sung without voices, carrying words no one could translate. Families said the hills themselves carried memory, that when the towns emptied, something older stepped in to hold their shape. This is what it means when a county vanishes. Not that the people are gone, but that the records no longer speak their names. Not that the towns are erased, but that the map refuses to acknowledge them. And in McDowell, silence became the perfect ground for Ashcroft to root itself. The story of Ashcroft cannot be told without tracing the family whose name the asylum carried, though even that lineage dissolves the closer one looks. The Ashcrofts appear in early census records from the 1880s, listed as landholders near Elkhorn Creek. A patriarch named Elias Ashcroft is noted in the 1880 census as proprietor, farm and timber, with a household of 6. Yet by 1890, no record of Elias remains. His property was transferred not through sale but by trust assignment, a phrase county ledgers rarely used outside of bank foreclosures. By 1900, the land is already marked for institutional use, though no deed exists between the Ashcroft family and the state. It is as if the land itself changed hands without the family, and the family vanished without record. The 1910 census lists a Sarah Ashcroft, age 27, marked as attendant in a local hospital, though no hospital other than Ashcroft existed in McDowell County at the time. By 1920, she no longer appears. Instead, payroll records for the asylum list a S. Ashcroft, with a signature identical to one found on 1910 census forms, suggesting she remained but only within the asylum's ledgers. When genealogists attempt to trace descendants, the line breaks into contradictions. Silas Ashcroft appears in court records as a licensed physician in 1904, 1937, and again in 1951. His medical license renewals carry the same signature across decades. The handwriting never alters with age. Families who lived in McDowell during the first half of the 20th century speak of the Ashcrofts with the vagueness of memory that has been cauterized. In 1948, a teacher in Kimball submitted a report to the county board noting that several children in her class listed Ashcroft as their surname, yet no such families appeared in enrollment rolls. When she pressed the children for addresses, they gave the name of the asylum itself. That teacher, identified in surviving board minutes as Margaret Wills, resigned the following year. Her personnel file states relocated to Tennessee, but no subsequent teaching certificate under her name has ever been found. The Hensleys, the McGraws, the Vickers, families rooted in McDowell for generations, all carry fragments of testimony about marriages or disappearances tied to the Ashcrofts. In 1927, a marriage license between Thomas Hensley and a woman listed only as L. Ashcroft was issued by the county clerk. No first name given, no parentage recorded. 3 months later, the license was voided on grounds of non-existence of spouse. Thomas Hensley enlisted in the army the following year and died in France, leaving no descendants. The voided license remains in the courthouse archive, stamped but unexplained. By the 1930s, the Ashcroft name no longer appeared in ordinary civic life. No voter rolls, no property tax submissions, no census households. Yet it remained fixed inside the asylum's rosters, where doctors, nurses, and attendants signed checks and requisitions under that name. Those signatures persist across nearly half a century, and each carries the same hand as if one person, or one thing, held the pen throughout. Oral history suggests the family was less a bloodline than a mantle. Folklorist Helen Bailey interviewed a miner's widow in 1959, who told her, "Ashcroft ain't a family, it's a taking. Once they have you, your name writes itself in their book. You don't pass it to children, you pass it to the house." Bailey's notes remain unpublished, but they circulate in Appalachian archives, each retelling slightly different yet carrying the same refrain. The Ashcrofts did not disappear, they multiplied without leaving descendants. The county's jail ledgers deepen the mystery. In 1915, 3 men, James Ashcroft, William Ashcroft, and Elias Ashcroft Jr., were recorded as arrested for disorderly conduct in Welch. Their names appear in the intake log but nowhere in the release log. The following week, the same jail ledger notes the men transferred to institution. No institution is listed. That year, Ashcroft State reported an increase in staff from 12 to 15, with payroll adding 3 orderlies bearing those exact names. From inmate to staff, without explanation, without release, without burial. By 1928, the name Ashcroft disappeared entirely from civic records outside the asylum. No obituaries, no marriages, no deeds, no children registered in schools. The surname was confined entirely to the asylum's ledgers, repeating across years as though immune to time. This disappearance from ordinary life was so complete that by the 1940 census, genealogical societies in Charleston listed the Ashcroft line as defunct, a family with no living members. Yet the payroll sheets from that very year list 5 Ashcrofts employed inside the institution. The contradiction sits unsolved in state archives, each file authenticated, each signature original. Those who attempt to trace the family in church records meet the same collapse. Baptismal registers in Elkhorn's Methodist congregation record 2 infants surnamed Ashcroft in 1907 and 1912. Both lines are later crossed out in red ink, margins noting void, no family by this name. Oral tradition adds further unease. Midwives in the hollows spoke of children born without sound, infants who never cried, whose names were whispered as Ashcroft before vanishing from record. The erasure of the family is not merely archival but cultural. In McDowell, surnames anchor memory. Hensley, McGraw, Mullins, these names carry weight, reputation, and lineage. But Ashcroft became a blank space, a name spoken only in warnings, never in kinship. Children were told not to play near the asylum ridge, not because of danger in the woods, but because the Ashcrofts will claim you. Such sayings were not ghost stories told to frighten but matter-of-fact rules spoken with the gravity of survival. Even now, genealogy researchers attempting to reconstruct McDowell's family trees find their data broken by the Ashcroft void. Digital records cross-reference names, but when Ashcroft appears, linked entries scatter into gaps. Birth certificates lack parents, death records lack causes, census forms trail off into nothing. It is a family defined not by what can be known but by what is withheld. By the time deputies uncovered Ashcroft's cabinets in 1951, the family had already ceased to exist outside those walls for more than 2 decades. And yet, their signatures signed every check, their names stamped every payroll, their presence maintained in the institution as if permanence was not a question of blood but of ritual. The Ashcrofts were last mentioned in Ordinary Life in 1928. After that, they lived only in the house that bore their name. And to this day, the ledger of Ashcroft is the only place the family survives. If the Ashcrofts were erased from the civic record, their persistence is marked in another archive, one not meant for public reading: the storage rooms beneath rural churches, where ledgers and hymnals bear annotations that never reached a pulpit. In 1936, a flood swept through Kimball, submerging the basement of the First Missionary Baptist Church. When volunteers cleared debris, they recovered a wooden crate of Bibles waterlogged yet intact, each with passages underlined in the same steady hand. The verses circled were not those of comfort but those that twisted promises into threats. Ecclesiastes 4 verse 2, which reads, "Wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead more than the living which are yet alive." Several copies bore the same margin note: "They must walk until they are named." These Bibles, catalogued briefly in the McDowell County Historical Society before disappearing in the 1970s, provide the only surviving evidence of doctrine linked to the Ashcroft Asylum. Hand-copied hymnals from the late 1920s surface with disturbing regularity in estate sales. Unlike traditional collections, these books contain entire sections of what appear to be chants, often written phonetically rather than in English. One fragment, discovered in a Mercer County farmhouse, repeats a refrain of syllables followed by the phrase, "Child in silence, child in silence." Musicologists who examined the fragment in 1981 noted its resemblance not to Appalachian folk music but to psalmic drones associated with medieval mortuary rites. The conclusion filed in that report was understated: this text suggests ritual use beyond normal congregational purpose. The family who donated the book claimed it had been in their attic for as long as they remembered, inscribed with the initials S.A., presumed to mean Sarah Ashcroft. Disciplinary ledgers from Ashcroft Asylum reinforced the sense that ritual functioned as medical routine. One entry dated February 12, 1933, records, "Subject refused to kneel. Correction administered with water and cord." Another dated April 9, 1935, states, "Infant failed to remain still. Applied measure of silence." These notations, scribbled in clinical shorthand, suggest practices that blurred devotion and punishment, where silence itself became both offering and cure. The absence of named patients in the files amplifies the horror. Each punishment logged, each ritual performed, but upon whom? Local testimony deepens the unease. In 1942, a traveling preacher named Reverend Otis Ward delivered a sermon in Harlan County warning against the book beneath the stone floor. His notes, found in the archives of Berea College, claim he was invited to Ashcroft to bless a child, only to be shown into a cellar where attendants knelt in a circle around an open Bible, reciting words he described as not language of this earth. Ward fled and never returned, his sermons afterward laced with warnings about those who sing without melody. His congregation dismissed him as paranoid, yet his decline into incoherence coincides precisely with the asylum's most active years. Whispers circulate still about a black-painted cross kept in a locked cabinet beneath Elkhorn Methodist. The object was described by an elderly congregant in 1974 as the cross with no Christ. She recalled it being brought into service during funerals where no body was present, funerals held at night with only family in attendance. When pressed for details, she claimed the cross was eventually taken back to the asylum, for it was theirs to keep. No such artifact has been recovered, though minutes from church meetings in the 1930s mention disputes over unusual symbols in liturgy. Children bore the deepest marks of these beliefs. In 1938, the McDowell County School Board received a report noting several students in North Fork Elementary who refused to sing the national anthem, explaining that singing outside the house is forbidden. Teachers described their drawings as repetitive circles crossed with vertical slashes, shapes now recognized by folklorists as protective marks found in Old World mortuary traditions. The board dismissed the matter as childish obstinance, yet several of the children listed in those reports do not appear in graduation rosters years later. Their enrollment records end abruptly, replaced by notations such as withdrew to home instruction or no longer resident. No forwarding addresses, no guardianship papers. Church basements remain the strongest link between these fragments. In 1969, University of Kentucky fieldworker John Everett cataloged oral histories in McDowell. One informant, unnamed in the surviving transcript, spoke of a hidden room beneath a white clapboard church where children were taken during storms. He claimed they were made to kneel before a book of no words, and told to keep their mouths shut until the bells stopped ringing. Everett described his source as credible but fearful, unwilling to let his name be attached. The tape was marked restricted and filed away. What emerges is less a coherent doctrine than a pattern of silence as devotion, of ritualized absence as inheritance. The Ashcroft Asylum appears less a medical institution than a sanctuary for a faith that inverted the functions of church and hospital alike. Treatment was indistinguishable from punishment, punishment indistinguishable from prayer. To erase names, to hush voices, to cross out infants in baptismal registers. These were not accidents of record-keeping but expressions of belief. The effect on the community was corrosive. Families who refused participation found themselves cut off from church fellowship, denied burial plots, and eventually leaving the county altogether. Property records in the 1940s show entire households vanishing between one tax year and the next, their land folded back into state hands. Those who remained kept to themselves, speaking less, singing less, raising children who would not cry aloud. The rituals became so normalized within the asylum's walls that by the time investigators pried open its cabinets in 1951, the surviving notes did not read as aberrations but as routine. Correction with water and cord. Applied measure of silence. Service held without voice. These were not written as crimes but as procedure, clerical as ink on paper. In the hollows of McDowell, silence itself became the inheritance. And to this day there are families who say their grandparents never sang, never hummed, never raised a hymn. As if some part of Ashcroft's doctrine remained in them, folded deep like a page beneath the stone floor, still unturned. It is one thing for a family name to vanish from census rolls, for church basements to carry rituals that no hymn book explains, for an institution to keep ledgers without patience. But history only tilts when the outside world is forced to look inward. For Ashcroft, that moment arrived in the spring of 1946, when a death could not be contained inside the house. On March 11, the Bluefield Daily Telegraph ran a brief, unassuming obituary: infant, surname withheld, interred at Elkhorn Hollow. Arrangements by county. No parents listed, no cause given. The notice should have slipped away like so many others, but 3 days later, the same paper carried a correction stating the child was not listed in county records at all, the grave unmarked, the permit unsigned. Journalists at the time were not permitted to pursue it further, but the slip was enough to spark whispers. That same month, the Board of Health convened in Welch after a complaint from a midwife named Clara Jennings. Her testimony, buried in state archives, notes that she was summoned to the asylum for what she assumed was a birth. Instead, she found a group of attendants gathered around a child already delivered, silent and unmoving. She was asked to sign a certificate of stillbirth, yet when she reached for the form, the infant's chest rose and fell with breath. Jennings refused. Her notes end there, but the following week her license was suspended for improper conduct, and by June she had left McDowell entirely. School records reveal another fissure. In April 1946, a teacher at North Fork Elementary, identified as Anna Grace Holloway, reported to the board that one of her students, a boy of 7, had come to class with his arms marked in what she described as rows of lines, evenly spaced like tally marks. When asked who had done it, he replied only, "The ones who watch." Holloway's report was logged but never acted upon. That autumn, she too resigned, citing personal reasons. No further trace of the boy exists in the enrollment ledger. Court archives hold the clearest glimpse of what happened when the wider world could not ignore the asylum's shadow. On May 2, 1946, a grand jury convened after the unexplained death of a coal inspector named Walter Pierce. His body had been found near the asylum grounds, his lungs filled not with water but with a pale, milky fluid described by the coroner as curdled like spoiled milk. The official cause was listed as pneumonia, but the file includes an unsigned memorandum noting that the substance did not match any known pathology. Pierce's widow swore under oath that he had been investigating irregularities in the asylum's coal shipments. Its boilers burned far more fuel than any patient census could justify. The case was sealed after 3 weeks. Local newspapers grew cautious, yet small notices slipped through. On May 19, 1946, the Charleston Gazette carried a report of unrest at Ashcroft State, claiming that 3 attendants had been dismissed after disciplinary concerns. No names provided, no charges filed. But payroll records for June list those same attendants still employed. The correction was never issued. It was as if the article itself was meant only as a flare, proof that something had surfaced before being dragged back down. The deepest cut came from a single photograph. In September 1946, The Welsh Sentinel printed an image of a burial at the county cemetery. The caption identified it as Pauper Interment, Ashcroft. Behind the line of officials and gravediggers, a group of children stand clustered in the background, their faces pale, their eyes reflecting the flashlight glass. The next week, the newspaper office suffered a fire that destroyed most of its photo archive. Only a singed clipping of the burial scene remains, preserved in a private scrapbook donated to the library decades later. The children in the frame are unidentifiable. None of their names appear in any school roster, church roll, or census. From 1946 forward, Ashcroft was no longer an invisible house on a hill. It was a wound stitched poorly, bleeding into public record despite every attempt at cauterization. Letters to the editor began appearing in local papers. Families claiming their kin had been taken for treatment and never returned, miners whispering about lights on the ridge at night, a nurse who left town suddenly after describing services that were not medical in nature. Each letter disappeared within days, replaced by editorials urging calm, dismissing rumors, insisting the asylum was a place of healing. Yet the silence felt brittle. Everyone in McDowell knew, but no one spoke without caution. The state's own files betray the tension. A 1947 audit of medical facilities lists Ashcroft as inactive, yet its operating budget increased by 30% that same year. Payroll remained steady. Coal shipments rose. No patients listed, no admissions recorded, and yet expenses swelled as though the asylum housed more life than it ever admitted. Life or something else. The outside world had noticed, but noticing was not enough. Each time a thread pulled loose, an obituary without a body, a boy with marks on his skin, a coroner's note about lungs filled with curdled milk, it was bound back in bureaucratic knots. Files sealed, careers ended, papers corrected by erasure. But the event of 1946 left a stain too deep for silence to scrub entirely. From then on, Ashcroft was no longer a forgotten institution. It was a rumor carried in official ink, visible only when you knew how to read between lines. And for the first time, the asylum's secrets leaked beyond the hollows, into the records of a state that would try, and fail, to bury them again. Every record of Ashcroft is hollow until it meets a voice, and those voices surface rarely, almost reluctantly, like breath beneath ice. Between 1947 and 1952, scattered testimonies appeared in letters, interviews, and fragments of psychiatric notes, each offered by someone who had either seen inside the asylum or carried its shadow away with them. Their words never lasted long in the public sphere, yet the scraps that remain are more disturbing than any ledger, for they give shape to what the files tried to keep nameless. The earliest testimony comes from a miner named Henry Cole, who in the winter of 1947 was admitted to Welch Hospital after a collapse underground. His intake notes, preserved in county medical archives, describe an outburst in which he claimed he had been sent below not by rock but by them from the house. When pressed by physicians, he repeated the phrase, "They walk without breath," before lapsing into muteness. Cole was discharged 3 weeks later and listed as missing within the month. His family claimed he wandered toward the ridge and never returned. The hospital notes mark his case, unresolved fugue state. In 1949, a University of Kentucky fieldworker named Elizabeth Rowan interviewed an elderly woman in Keystone known locally as Granny Marrow. Rowan's transcript, now housed in Berea College's folklore archive, records the woman describing how she once worked laundry for the asylum. She claimed the linens arrived not stained with blood or dirt but with the smell of milk turned sour and the weight of someone still inside them. When Rowan asked her to clarify, the old woman grew agitated, insisting, "You never wash them clean for the name still clings." 2 weeks after the interview, Rowan attempted to revisit the woman but found her house abandoned, possessions intact, food rotting on the table. No death certificate was ever filed. The most chilling testimony lies in a 1950 asylum staff log recovered during the 1951 investigation. Among the roster is a disciplinary note against a nurse identified only as E. Whitaker. The note reads, "Attendant spoke to subject when rule is silence. Removed from service. Referred for correction." No further record of Whitaker exists. No forwarding employment, no obituary, no family claim. It is as if the act of speech itself erased her from the living record. Yet the single line of reprimand preserves her existence, proof of a witness who broke rule and was consumed by it. Children, too, spoke briefly before being muted. In January 1951, just months before deputies forced open the asylum's cabinets, a boy of 9 appeared at a church service in Hemphill. According to the pastor's handwritten notes, the boy walked barefoot to the pulpit and said, "They read our names backwards until we vanish." He was led away by relatives and never attended service again. No birth certificate for him has been located, nor any school enrollment. The note remains penciled in the margins of that Sunday's sermon, one line of horror tucked between verses. Perhaps the most direct testimony comes from Asylum records misfiled into psychiatric case studies at Pineville. A folder labeled simply Case 402A contains a single page. Subject: female, approximate 15, found unresponsive near Elkhorn Creek. No shoes. No tracks. Speech upon revival: they buried me before I was born. Transferred to Ashcroft. The page ends there and signed. That girl's name, if she had one, is absent, but her words echo the same logic carried across other fragments. That Ashcroft was less a hospital than a machine of erasure, a place where lives were unmade as if they had never begun. The pattern of witnesses vanishing after their accounts is too consistent to ignore. Those who spoke left behind traces but not futures. Their homes abandoned, their employment terminated, their family lines cut. Even when their words were preserved in ink, the people themselves dissolved. Researchers in later decades describe this as a form of archival haunting, where the record insists upon a voice that reality refuses to hold. One of the last surviving testimonies comes from a woman identified only as Mrs. Callahan, interviewed in 1952 by anthropologist Marlene Price. Price's journal, now partially digitized, records Callahan whispering, "They never asked me to heal them. They asked me to listen, and when I listened I heard no breath. Just the turning of pages." Price notes that Callahan refused to continue, staring at the corner of the room until she could be excused. A year later, Price returned to McDowell to locate her, but found her name struck from all directories. Even the house she had lived in was listed under another family as if she had never been there. What ties these testimonies together is their brevity, their incompleteness. Each voice emerges for a moment, naming the unnameable, then collapses into silence or disappearance. None of them lived long enough in the record to provide a full account. Yet when read side by side, they form a grim chorus. Men who saw figures walking without breath, women who laundered linens heavy with invisible presence, children who spoke of names read backwards, attendants punished for breaking silence. It is not one voice but many, each cut off before it could become whole. The witness is the most fragile element of Ashcroft's history. The files can be explained away as clerical error, the rituals as folk superstition, the graves as poorhouse necessity. But the words spoken aloud, recorded in shaky handwriting, preserve a truth that resists dismissal. They show that Ashcroft's horror was not abstract, not rumor, not misfiled paperwork. It was seen, heard, smelled, touched. And every person who testified, however briefly, was unmade by the weight of what they revealed. Their words remain, brittle as onion skin paper, smudged in margins, crossed through in red ink, tucked into archives that were never meant to be reopened. And though the witnesses are gone, their voices remain, echoes that remind us that Ashcroft did not operate on patients, but on something else entirely. If the witnesses gave the first fractures in the silence of Ashcroft, it was the suppression that sealed them shut again, not by accident but by design. The story of Ashcroft is not just a tale of missing patients or erased families. It is the story of how institutions, courts, churches, newspapers, sheriffs, turned their gaze away or worse, actively bent the record until it snapped. Evidence of suppression begins as early as 1932, when the Welch County Court ordered the consolidation of health records under the Department of Public Welfare. Files from smaller clinics were transferred, yet the box marked Ashcroft arrived empty except for payroll sheets. A clerk's notation reads simply, "Medical records withheld." No further comment. That absence became the first of many. In 1941, a reporter for the Charleston Gazette named Ruth Fowler attempted to cover the unexplained deaths near Elkhorn. Her notes, preserved in private correspondence, describe graves without markers and families unwilling to speak. She filed her article in October of that year. The Gazette printed nothing. 2 weeks later, Fowler's press pass was revoked, and she took a position in another state. Her draft remained unpublished until it surfaced decades later in a donation to the State Historical Society. In its margin she had scrawled, "They warned me, stop asking. The House keeps its own press." The most overt act of suppression occurred in 1947, when the courthouse fire destroyed dozens of case files. Official reports blame faulty wiring, yet fire maps from that year show the blaze concentrated only in the wing holding health inquests and coroner's reports. Among the losses were the notes on Walter Pierce's death, already contested by his widow, and the disciplinary hearings against staff dismissed for unorthodox practices. A surviving docket sheet lists their names but no outcomes. When auditors asked for explanation, the sheriff's office replied that the files had perished in flame. Yet townspeople recalled seeing deputies carry boxes into trucks the day before, driving them toward the ridge. Suppression did not rely only on fire or absence. It used human intermediaries, pastors who counseled silence, sheriffs who threatened inquiry, editors who pulled columns. In 1950, the Reverend Thomas Glenn of Elkhorn Methodist preached a sermon titled The Sin of Curiosity. In his surviving notes, he equates prying into forbidden houses with trespassing against the Lord's order. Parishioners later recalled how the sermon was directed at young men who had been caught near the asylum fence. Glenn's role in discouraging questions was so effective that church elders praised his containment of unrest in meeting minutes the following month. The notes remain in denominational archives, a record of faith turned into a mechanism of control. Sheriffs, too, served as gatekeepers. McDowell County Sheriff Harold Beavers, in office from 1944 to 1952, left behind an unusually sparse archive of reports. Yet one surviving memorandum from 1948 reads, "Any disturbances near Ashcroft grounds to be referred directly to institution security. No local jurisdiction." This extraordinary statement effectively placed the asylum outside county law. Deputies knew better than to cross that line. Oral testimony from retired Officer Samuel Vickers in 1971 recalled, "We were told, plain as day, you go up there, you don't come back with your badge." He never put that in writing until his interview decades later, but the silence among his colleagues speaks louder than ink. Journalists who tried to investigate met similar fates. In 1951, after the discovery of the asylum's empty patient files, the Bluefield Daily Telegraph announced a forthcoming series titled The Vanished of Ashcroft. Only the first installment ran, detailing the strange burial permits of 1951. The second installment never appeared. Bound volumes of the newspaper contain only a blank column where the article should have been, as if the text was stripped at press. Employees who later spoke off record claimed the state intervened, threatening license revocation if the story continued. Within months, the newspaper ceased all mention of the asylum. The machinery of suppression extended even to families themselves. Death certificates were issued with vague causes: respiratory failure, failure to thrive, complications unknown, phrases that concealed more than they revealed. In at least a dozen cases, parents were pressured to sign forms under threat of losing county assistance or mining employment. Oral accounts describe officials arriving at homes with documents already filled out, requiring only signatures. The grief-stricken complied, their losses sealed in bureaucracy. The final layer of suppression was the rewriting of maps. Beginning in 1952, state cartographic surveys ceased marking Ashcroft at all. Earlier maps from the 1920s and 30s label it clearly as State Asylum. By the mid-50s, the ridge is rendered as blank woodland. Property deeds for surrounding parcels list only State Reserve. To the outsider, the institution ceased to exist. Only locals remembered the road, the gates, the lights at night. For anyone else, Ashcroft was erased not only from record but from geography itself. This coordinated silencing cannot be mistaken for neglect. It was deliberate, patterned, reinforced across institutions. Fires that consumed only certain files. Sermons that warned against questions. Papers that censored themselves. Deputies who handed jurisdiction to the House itself. Suppression was not the absence of information. It was the presence of control, an active hand guiding the narrative away from what Ashcroft was and toward what it was not. By the time investigators pried open the cabinets in 1951, the machinery of suppression was already decades in motion. It had ensured that witnesses vanished, journalists fell silent, families accepted vagueness, churches preached obedience, and maps themselves denied existence. Ashcroft survived not because it was hidden but because every voice that could reveal it was trained, or forced, to say nothing. And in that silence, the House endured, standing not only as an institution of erasure but as a monument to the power of suppression itself. By the time the official record had erased Ashcroft, the building itself remained, a contradiction too large to ignore and yet too dreadful to acknowledge. Standing 3 miles off State Route 52, past a switchback road where even county plows stopped in winter, the asylum loomed as if it had been abandoned mid-breath. Census documents for 1954 omit the structure entirely, but property tax ledgers still show expenditures. Roof repairs in 56, boiler maintenance in 59, an unexplained purchase of lime and gravel in 61. Someone, somewhere, kept the house alive even as the maps declared it dead. Those who risked climbing the ridge in the decades after its supposed closure described the same sight. Windows boarded but glowing faintly at night, weeds curling through foundation stones, chimneys coughing smoke without a known fire. Former coal worker Ernest Cole wrote in a 1967 letter to his sister, "The place stands wrong. The air goes sour before you reach the gate. It feels like walking into milk gone bad, thick and curdled, not fit for breathing." He and others insisted that animals avoided the property entirely. Hunters told of hounds refusing to cross the fence line, tails tucked, eyes rolled white. A farmer from Pageton claimed that his mules collapsed on the road whenever he tried to haul timber past the ridge. He stopped using that path altogether, saying simply, "They know what waits up there. Photographs are rare and those that exist are unreliable." A 1972 expedition by students from Concord College produced several rolls of film, but when developed, most frames appeared fogged or warped, as though light bent unnaturally within the walls. Of the few images that survived, one shows the main entrance with its iron lettering, Ashcroft State, the last word broken off. Another captures a corridor of doors, each numbered, yet none aligned with architectural blueprints filed with the state. Dr. Marlene Price, the anthropologist who had earlier studied the unmarked graves, examined the photographs and wrote in her field journal, "The building persists beyond its own record, architecture divorced from memory. To enter it is to remember something you never lived." Local children turned the site into a dare, testing courage by creeping as close as they could. But every account of such trespasses ends with retreat. One group in 1978 carved their initials into the gatepost and fled after hearing what they described as nursery songs, coming from the chimney, voices too soft to belong to men. Decades later, their carvings remain, the letters weathered but legible, as though the wood itself refuses to decay. The state attempted demolition in 1983, or at least that was the story. County contracts show funds allocated to a construction firm from Beckley for structural removal. Yet no record exists of work completed, no photographs of rubble, no landfill receipts. Instead, residents swear the house stood untouched the following spring, not even scaffolding against its walls. When asked years later, a surviving contractor claimed, "We brought machines. They quit working at the gate. Not stalled, dead. Engines drained like the fuel was memory itself. We left and didn't come back." What unsettles researchers most is not that the building survived but that it appears to adapt. Floor plans sketched in 1950 by state inspectors show 4 wards and a central administration wing. Visitors in the 1970s described staircases that spiraled into basements not marked on any blueprint. By the 1990s, thrill seekers swore the house shifted between visits, doors vanishing, hallways stretching longer, rooms multiplying like cells in a body. One folklorist compared it to a lung still breathing though the patient has long since died. Property records continue to show expenditures through the 2000s, as if taxes are still paid, but no payee is listed. County clerks record the funds arriving as state maintenance, yet no agency claims responsibility. The house therefore persists both physically and bureaucratically, funded but disowned, standing yet unacknowledged. In this contradiction lies its deepest wrongness, a place that cannot be erased because it refuses to end. For those who approach even today, the most common report is silence. Not the ordinary hush of woodland but an active stillness, as though the trees themselves hold breath. Birds veer wide of the chimneys, refusing to perch on rooflines. Rain falls differently near the ridge, heavy drops that stain clothes with a sour smell. Even snow is said to melt unevenly, leaving black patches that resemble footprints far too wide to belong to men. If the asylum had been merely a ruin, time would have claimed it. Bricks would have crumbled, roofs collapsed, walls buckled. Instead, Ashcroft stands, its wrongness renewing itself with each passing decade. Not alive, not dead, but something in between. An institution without patience. A house without memory. A body without soul. And to this day those who walk the road past the ridge say the same thing. It is not that the house is haunted, it is that the house itself haunts. If Ashcroft had been an isolated madness, the story might have ended on that ridge, confined to the hollowed halls and unmarked graves. But records scattered across Appalachia whisper of something wider, a pattern drawn not in ink but in silence, connecting families who never should have shared a history. Property deeds in McDowell, Wyoming, and Buchanan counties reveal the same peculiar detail. Land held under surnames absent from local census rolls, taxes paid for generations by people who never appeared in churches, schools, or obituaries. The Ashcrofts were only the beginning. In a 1938 roster from the Pineville School District, 5 children are listed under the surname Lawton. No photographs, no birth certificates, just names in pencil beside the attendance tally. By 1942 the same 5 names, unchanged in age, appear again in Logan County's records, enrolled hundreds of miles away, with handwriting eerily similar to the Pineville log. Teachers who later gave testimony spoke of children who never raised their voices, never joined in song, and blinked only when prompted. When the state board investigated, the ledgers vanished, replaced by blank pages bound into the book as though no records had ever existed. Newspapers tell their own oblique story. The Bluefield Daily Telegraph, April 5, 1957, carried a single-paragraph obituary: Mrs. Delilah McCraw, survived by no kin, interred quietly. No funeral notice, no flowers, no pastor listed. Yet 2 weeks later, in a property sale notice tucked in the classifieds, the McCraw farm was purchased by Ashcroft Holdings, LLC, a company not incorporated anywhere in state records. The same phrasing recurs in clippings from Harlan, Grundy, and Pikeville. Land once tied to families with fading surnames passing into invisible hands. Each deed leads back to a trust headquartered nowhere, its offices unlisted, its payments always in cash. Oral history provides more chilling threads. In the 1960s, field workers with the WPA Folklore Project interviewed Cole widow Ada Rigsby, who recalled gatherings in a church basement where prayers ran backward and children were taught to hum, not speak. Her testimony never entered the official archive but survives in a carbon copy passed between researchers. She names not only the Ashcrofts but the Laughtons, the Yates, the McCraws, all marked by what she called the quiet blood. Patterns appear in the graveyards too. Old cemeteries in Welch and Oceana contain rows of stones with birth dates but no deaths, carved only with a single year repeated, 1928, 1928, 1928, as though every child in a family was born in the same moment. Genealogists struggle to explain why no death records match, why census entries end abruptly, or why voter rolls contain signatures in the same hand across multiple decades. The house on the ridge is only one manifestation. Similar structures, barns, schoolhouses, shuttered churches, carry local legends of rooms that won't stay shut. In Pike County, children whispered of a one-room schoolhouse where the blackboard rewrote lessons in unfamiliar script each morning. In Buchanan, an abandoned parsonage was said to smell of milk and rot long after the roof collapsed. And in McDowell, more than one trespasser swore that inside Ashcroft's locked wards were photographs of faces that didn't belong to patients but to entire neighboring families. Every researcher who follows these strands comes to the same unease. It isn't the families who resemble the asylum, it is the asylum that resembles the families. What Ashcroft did in its wards had already been rehearsed for generations in kitchens, basements, and hollow churches scattered across the hills. The asylum was not an origin but a collection point, a place where the names converged, where rituals from disparate hollows found a single roof. One fragment from the 1973 Journal of Drive Marlene Price chills the most. Patterns cannot be dismissed as coincidence. It is as though an unseen author wrote the same script into separate bloodlines, only to bring them together within Ashcroft's walls. The surnames vary but the handwriting remains constant. They are not patients, not families, they are iterations. And so the pattern stretches outward like veins beneath skin, untraceable in full but undeniable in shape. Each county has its silences, its erased census rows, its gravestones carved without deaths. Ashcroft was never a single house of horror. It was the mirror in which Appalachia caught a glimpse of something older than its own memory, something that multiplied not by birth but by repetition. The pattern endures. The surnames change but the silences remain. And if you walk the ridges long enough, the same doors appear. Different wood, different locks, always leading to the same room. For decades the Ashcroft file gathered dust, the ridge avoided, the surnames spoken only in whispers. Researchers assumed the pattern had thinned with migration, that the closing of coal mines and the scattering of families broke whatever chain bound them to that place. But in the last 20 years, the silence has begun to fracture, and signs of return have surfaced like stains that refuse to wash out. Police logs from 2004 in Tazewell County record a teacher's call. A child in her classroom was drawing the same sigil over and over. A looping figure 8 twisted until it resembled an endless corridor. When asked what it meant, the boy replied, "It's the way out of the house." No house was mentioned to him before. He had never left the county. Yet when shown photographs of abandoned buildings from McDowell, he pointed directly at Ashcroft. In 2011, a woman named Clara Yates filed a complaint with local authorities in Grundy, Virginia. She claimed that for 3 nights running she heard voices outside her trailer, humming what she called the milk hymn. Investigators searched but found no trespassers. Clara insisted she recognized the tune from her childhood in Welch, though her family swore she never attended church. In her statement she said, "It's the same hymn they sang in the basement when they made us drink the water." No one could determine what water she meant. Her report was filed under nuisance, but neighbors later confirmed they too heard humming on windless nights, low and steady as though coming through the ground. Digital traces confirmed the pattern spreading further. A 2016 Reddit thread titled "Weird Stuff in Appalachia" included an anonymous post from a college student at Marshall University. The user uploaded photographs of notebook doodles found in library books, sketches of the Ashcroft Gate, the phrase "state, state, state" written in rows, and crude maps of the Ridge Trail. Replies mocked it as an ARG, but within days multiple accounts from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio added similar sketches, always unsigned, always left behind in random books. Librarians in Huntington, Charleston, and Pikeville admitted they had quietly removed such drawings for years, assuming them to be pranks, until the online thread revealed their consistency. Facebook messages archived in 2018 show a disturbing exchange between two women from opposite ends of Appalachia. Both described their children sleepwalking into woods, stopping at clearings, and humming a monotone tune until woken. Neither family knew each other. Both mentioned the surname McCraw somewhere in their ancestry. Private messages sent to folklorists reveal the same phrases repeated across states. "They don't cry, they hum before they speak. The doors don't stay shut." The return is not only auditory or visual. In 2020, volunteers restoring the cemetery in Welch uncovered fresh disturbances among the stones marked only with 1928. Soil was loose, though no burials had been recorded in nearly a century. Forensic teams brought in by county officials claimed animal activity, but photographs show earth shifted in perfect rectangles, as though graves had been reopened and resealed. Dr. Ellen Krauss, a forensic anthropologist, noted, "There are no claw marks, no signs of scavenging. It looks more like exhumation and reburial." She refused further comment after her initial report. Those who live nearest the ridge say the atmosphere has grown heavier in recent years, not lighter with time. Hunters claim game avoids the area by wider margins. Loggers describe the trees leaning subtly inward toward the asylum site as though drawn. One man reported a boy's laughter echoing through his radio static while he worked his skidder, though no children were within miles. He quit the job the next morning. The chilling detail is not that these incidents recur, it is that they accelerate. Where once decades separated the sightings and songs, now they appear yearly, monthly, sometimes within the same week across counties. The rituals seem to be reawakening, drawn not to individuals but to bloodlines, resurfacing in children who should have been free of the history. Every incident adds weight to the idea that Ashcroft was not an institution with a beginning and end, but a kind of contagion written into the marrow of families, waiting for its season to bloom again. In her final lecture notes before retiring in 2019, Dr. Marlene Price wrote one line circled 3 times, "Ashcroft was never closed. It only waits for those born ready to enter." Her words read less like scholarship than a warning. Because when the humming begins in a child's throat, or when the sigil appears in their drawings, the question is not where they learned it. The question is how they remembered it. And so the return is not in the building, nor the graves, nor even the silence of towns. It is in the children whose voices carry songs no living adult taught them. It is in the handwriting that repeats itself across decades. It is in the graves disturbed not by scavengers but by memory itself, clawing back to the surface. The return is happening again, not as a haunting but as a continuation, a pattern waking from its long pause, demanding to be lived once more. In every archive there is a residue, a margin note, a smudge of handwriting, a name that should not belong where it appears. With Ashcroft, the residue is the name itself. It surfaces where it should not, always in the same looping cursive, the same pressure of ink, whether in 1922 or 1978, as though the hand that wrote it had never aged. In McDowell County Court proceedings from 1934, a witness signature reads, L. Ashcroft. The case had nothing to do with the asylum, involving only a land dispute between coal companies, yet the signature matches exactly one found on an asylum requisition form from 1950. Same slant, same trailing flourish. Handwriting experts consulted decades apart refused to dismiss it as coincidence. This is the same hand, one wrote, but across time frames too wide to be possible. Patterns multiply. In 1946, a marriage license filed in Pike County lists the bride as Margaret Ashcroft. No census before or after records her existence. The address given on the license does not correspond to any street ever mapped. Yet when the document was pulled in 1971 by a genealogist tracing the name, the original page was found altered. Margaret's surname had been changed in matching ink to Hensley. Microfilm copies, however, still show Ashcroft. Records rewritten not by clerks but by the name itself. A similar incident occurred with the Lawtons, whose school attendance records seemed to drift. A 1952 ledger from Logan County listed 4 Lawton children, but by 1956 the same ledger contained the same entries under the surname Ashcroft. Teachers who once spoke the name Lawton began insisting they had always been Ashcrofts, even when presented with carbon copies of their original reports. Oral history shifts too. Families who once claimed Yates or McCraw ancestry fall silent, or correct themselves, saying no, it was always Ashcroft, though birth certificates and basements say otherwise. The name erases rivals, swallows kinships, rewrites the past with each utterance. Dr. Marlene Price, in her 1973 journal, described the phenomenon with unease. When the name is spoken aloud, memory rearranges to accommodate it. It is not an addition to the record but a substitution. What we thought we knew is overwritten. Ashcroft is less a family than a solvent. Her notes include a chilling anecdote. While conducting interviews in Mercer County, an elderly woman corrected the spelling of her maiden name mid-sentence. Price's tape recorder captured her voice shifting. First Lawton, then a pause, then the same voice repeating Ashcroft, as if the first word had never been said. On playback, the tape contained only Ashcroft. The woman's lips had formed 2 names, but the machine registered 1. Even in the asylum's surviving papers, the instability persists. A requisition log from 1949 lists supplies ordered under Ashcroft State Asylum. Later that same year, another version of the document lists the name as State Hospital Ashcroft Division. The signatures are identical. The stationery bears no correction marks. It is as if the institution itself changed titles in retrospect, aligning with whatever version the name required at that moment. This effect stretches beyond documents into human recollection. Journalists reviewing their own articles decades later find discrepancies. An obituary published in 1962 for a nurse named Lillian Carter now reads Lillian Ashcroft in archived newspapers, though surviving family members insist it never did. Microfiche copies vary by library, some showing Carter, others Ashcroft, as though the paper itself cannot decide. One archivist described it as a name with gravity, pulling ink into its orbit. The deeper researchers look, the more the name appears as a mechanism rather than a label. Families vanish into it, records bend around it, and witnesses cannot speak against it without being corrected by their own tongues. The repetition across counties, across generations, across formats suggests something closer to contagion than genealogy. Ashcroft is not simply remembered, it remembers itself, asserting presence where it did not belong, until it becomes the only version left. In 1989, during a historical preservation effort in Welch, a team uncovered a cornerstone beneath a collapsed church foundation. The engraving read, "Erected by the People, 1908." Below that, smaller, sharper, and deeper than the rest, one word, Ashcroft. Stonemasons examined it and claimed the bottom inscription was etched later, but weathering showed equal age to the rest of the stone. It had always been there and yet arrived afterward, an impossibility turned permanent. This is the nature of the name. It does not simply identify, it revises. It replaces. It consumes. Speak it and records alter. Deny it and the denial erases itself. Those who continue the investigation find their own files inexplicably altered, their typed reports carrying the signature L. Ashcroft at the bottom where none had signed. It is not just a history but a living correction, bending all other histories toward itself. And in that correction lies the deepest horror, the fear that the asylum never operated on ghosts at all. It operated on names, stripping away identity until only one remained. Ashcroft is not a family, not a place, not a time. It is the record itself, the handwriting that endures across decades, writing and rewriting until every silence bears its mark. There comes a point in every investigation where the paper trail turns inward, where the documents no longer lead outward into facts but spiral back into the one holding them, reshaping memory, altering the act of looking itself. With Ashcroft, that moment arrives in the final box of county files labeled simply miscellaneous. Inside, the folders are charred at the edges, numbers burned away, contents fragile as moth wings. The first sheets are blank, the ink lifted as though dissolved by invisible hands. Yet beneath the light, faint impressions remain like scars on the page. Names appear and fade, Lawton, McCraw, Yates, each crossing itself out until only Ashcroft remains, deep enough to break the fibers of the paper. The last recorded attempt to map the asylum grounds came in 1994, when state surveyors tried to chart the ridge for potential highway expansion. Their report ended abruptly. The blueprints they filed with the Department of Transportation include no building, only a hollow shaded in gray, annotated with the phrase, "Area Inaccessible." But in the margins, scrawled in a hand that matches requisition forms from 1951, someone had written coordinates. When checked decades later, the coordinates no longer resolved. Satellite images blur at that exact point, as if the Earth itself rejects the imprint. The ridge is there, the trees are there, but the house does not appear. Archivists whisper of the burned name. In several counties, ledgers show an entire line blackened by fire, though the rest of the page remains untouched. The heat marks form perfect rectangles, erasing only where the name should be. Handwriting analysts cannot explain the precision. One describes it as a redaction by flame. In oral testimony, elders recall dreams where they tried to remember the old surnames, only to wake with one word in their mouths. When asked to repeat it, their voices falter, as though speaking it seals something deeper than memory. The silence spreads to sound itself. A journalist in 2007 recorded an interview with a man claiming his grandmother had been born inside Ashcroft. Playback reveals only static punctuated by a hum, low and steady, lasting the exact length of the interview. The journalist insists he heard the man's voice clearly in person, yet on tape it was erased. Later attempts to digitize the file produced nothing but empty space, the hum deepening with each conversion. Even physical artifacts resist. A rusted key said to belong to Ward C was stored in the McDowell Historical Society. Within a year, it had fused into its display case, metal sinking into glass like wax. When the case was opened, the key crumbled into powder, leaving only the faint outline of its teeth etched into the pane. Visitors say the outline changes each season, some claiming it now resembles a hand, others a mouth. Researchers end not with answers but with recursion. Every lead circles back, every name collapses into one, every silence grows heavier. The more one digs, the more one realizes that the asylum's greatest cruelty was not its treatment of patients. It was the erasure of patients entirely, the insistence that only staff existed, that the building operated without subjects, that the rituals performed inside were not upon flesh but upon the record itself. To look for the people is to find only paper. To look for the paper is to find only the name. To look for the name is to lose one's own. And so the story concludes not with revelation but with refusal. A house that remains without existing. A name that rewrites all others. Graves that mark no deaths, only repetitions. A file that resists closing. What began as evidence becomes instead contagion, spreading through memory, pulling all who speak it into its orbit. The deeper one reads, the more certain the outcome. We were never meant to know this, and knowing does not free us. It completes the work begun in silence. Even now the final page lies open. Its lines are faint, its ink unstable, its coordinates unresolvable. What it contains is less a record than a warning, written not to inform but to ensure forgetting. Yet the warning fails because the act of reading is the act of remembering. The file that wasn't supposed to be found is found again, and with each telling the silence deepens. The end is not an end. It is a blank entry, a burned line, a hollow ridge where no map will hold steady. The house remains. The name endures. And the record, whether read or erased, continues itself.